collecting his reasonable fees. Sometimes a number of rich men will band together and send one of their number in to get and pay for the service. Then they will all use it. If it surprises you that there are millionaires who will stoop to such petty chiseling, you should get out and meet more millionaires. Sometimes the advice, though perhaps good, does not seem sufficiently spectacular. There was a man who took his large estate to the investment council and emerged looking a little dazed. "What did they tell you to do?" asked his friend. "They told me to sell everything and put all the money except $3,500 into government bonds." "What did they tell you to do with the $3,500? "They told me to give it to them." A little wonderful advice. For no fee at all, I am prepared to offer to any wealthy person an investment program which will last a lifetime, and will not only preserve the estate, but greatly increase it. Like other great ideas, this one is simple. When there is a stock market boom and everyone is scrambling for common stocks, take all your common stocks and sell them. Take the proceeds and buy conservative bonds. No doubt the stocks you sold will go higher. Pay no attention to this. Just wait for the depression, which will come sooner or later. When this depression or panic becomes a national catastrophe, sell out the bonds, perhaps at a loss, and buy back the stocks. No doubt the stocks will go still lower. Again, pay no attention. Wait for the next boom. Continue to repeat this operation as long as you live, and you'll have the pleasure of dying rich. A glance at financial history will show that there was never a generation for whom this advice would not have worked splendidly. But it distresses me to report that I have never enjoyed the social acquaintance of anyone who managed to do it. It looks as easy as rolling off a log, but it isn't. The chief difficulties, of course, are psychological. It requires buying bonds when bonds are generally unpopular, and buying stocks when stocks are universally detested. I suspect that there are actually a few people who do something like this, even though I have never had the pleasure of meeting them. I suspect it because someone must buy the stocks when the suckers sell at those awful prices, a fact usually outside the consciousness of the public and of financial reporters. An experienced reporter's poetic account in the paper following a day of terrible panic reads this way. Large selling was in evidence at the opening bell and gained steadily in volume and violence throughout the morning session. At noon, a rally, dishearteningly brief, took place as a result of short covering. But a new selling wave soon threw the market into utter chaos, and during the final hour, equities were thrown overboard in huge lots without regard for price or value. The public reads the papers, and reading the foregoing, it gets the impression that on that catastrophic day everyone sold and nobody bought except that little band of shorts who most likely didn't exist. Of course, there is just no truth in that at all. If on that day the terrific selling amounted to 7,365,000 shares, the volume of the buying can also be calculated. In this case, it was 7,365,000 shares. Price and Value, our special market letter. At this point, we shall take up the subject of price and value, because any financial writer who doesn't explain this knotty matter has his union card taken away from him. I shall not beat around the bush with generalities, but I will step right in and analyze for you the price and value of the best-known stock in the world. This is the common stock of the United States Steel Corporation, familiarly called Steel, Big Steel, and Big X by its many cronies. First, as to price, on which I happen to be well informed, I can state without fear of successful contradiction that steel closed yesterday quoted at 57 5/8 to 58, last sale 57 3/4. This price was arrived at because at about 3 p.m. yesterday, someone, maybe one of the specialists, maybe a lady in Brooklyn, was willing to pay 57 5/8 for at least 100 shares, and someone else, maybe another specialist, maybe a fat man with a wen in Brussels, was willing to sell at 58. Goodness only knows what were the motives of these people. So you can see that the price of U.S. steel was determined in an extremely chancy fashion. There is only one nice thing to be said in favor of that price. It was a very definite number and good all over the world at that time. Now let us turn to that eternal verity, value. We will examine the corporation's earnings, which are applicable to the common stock over a period of the last 10 years. My word, there are more losses than earnings. There was a period of time when not even the preferred stock earned its keep. And now they have a large bond issue out. And what will be the effects of the war? That just shows you how silly a price of 57.75 is. 17.75 would be more like it, and a man ought to have his head examined who pays more than that for it in anything except Confederate money. But, on the other hand, and notwithstanding and not so fast, there are other elements in the picture and a broader viewpoint to be considered. The steel industry is the most basic of basic industries, and the United States Steel Corporation is, and has been for 40 years, a veritable giant in the field, irreproducible and unapproachable. The total of its yearly losses during the late Depression is less than its earnings in any one of the several profitable years prior to 1930, and it would not require much of an increase in operations for great profits again to pour forth. And what will be the effect of the war? Look at that big bond issue, how easily and on what favorable terms that financing was done. In view of these and many other bullish factors, it is hard to see why this, the most seasoned stock known to finance, is not selling at 157.75. And who shall call us visionary to suggest 257.75? It once did a trifle better than that, and looked cheap to a great many experienced people. It is quite unnecessary for you all to crowd around in this fashion, thanking me for the above analysis of the true value of steel common. It really wasn't difficult. The steel business is a comprehensible one, and all facts and figures on it are published in Iron Age. In many other industries, such precise figuring is not possible. The analysis of a chemical company, for example, is more difficult. After considering everything else, the investor never knows just when one of the company's scientists, working in a green eye shade in the research laboratories, will discover how to distill vitamin V out of discarded cellophane wrappers. I will conclude this discussion of price and value with the following unimportant occurrence circa 1928. There was at that time engaged in the bank stock business, along with an awful lot of others, a large red-necked Texan. He had brought to his profession a booming Texas voice and a calcified conscience. On this occasion, he had just sold a customer 20 shares of guaranteed trust company stock at $760 a share at a moment when it could have been purchased anywhere else at $730. The customer, the big sorehead, had just found this out and had called back with a view toward remonstrance. The Texan cut him short. "Sir," he boomed, "you all don't appreciate what the policy of this firm is. This here firm selects investments for its clients not on a basis of price, but of value." Cash as a long-term investment. For those wealthy people who have not yet found in these pages an investment program which appeals to them, here is another plan which at least has certain originality. It was outlined to me by a bond trader one afternoon. We had been discussing the broad history of investment bonds, a depressing subject. The man had spent the last 30 years trading bonds with other people's money. His own money he had always carefully spent. I finally said, "What a hopeless game. Tell me, Mac, what would you do if you had today $250,000 of your own?" He answered with such promptness that I could see he had given a good deal of thought to this improbability. I would put it into 25 envelopes in cash of $10,000 each. I would put the envelopes into a safe deposit box. I have been told you can get a small one, such as I would need, for only $6 a year. At the beginning of each year, I would take out an envelope, and I would risk not living more than 25 years longer. That would give me $200 a week. But since a man has to be doing something, and I like gambling, I would live on $100 a week, and with the other, I would play the horse races. That would give me a real interest in life. Most weeks I'd live at the rate of 100, but occasionally at the rate of 1,000. And for an added pleasure, I could laugh at the income tax collector. But the percentage against you on the horses is certainly as bad as in the market, I reminded him. Worse, he said cheerfully, but playing the horses is at least fun. Your Way of Life and the Basis Book. The Basis Book, usually bound in limp black and religious in appearance, is a collection of tables by which bondmen can quickly calculate precise income yields on various bond investments. A good investment advisor is supposed to run his finger across the tables to as high a yield as is commensurate with the amount of safety required by the particular investor. And his experienced finger should stop right there like a divining rod. Just how far his finger should venture towards the right-hand side of the page is a matter of tremendous importance for the investor. The problem is not limited to mathematics. It invades the borders of philosophy. The investor's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are all at stake. Take care of the pennies, and the dollars will take care of themselves, is better than a half-truth, about a 5/8 truth, I should say. At least as accurate is, take care of the $1 million, and the pennies will take care of themselves. The British, as a race, have been engaged with the problems of capital investment for a longer period than we have, and accordingly have reached a greater maturity regarding it. Have you ever noticed that when you ask a Britisher about a man's wealth, you get an answer quite different from that an American gives you? The American says, "I wouldn't be surprised if he's worth close to $1 million. The Englishman says, "I fancy he has £5,000 a year." The Englishman's habitual way of speaking and thinking about wealth is, of course, much closer to the nub of the matter. A man's true wealth is his income, not his bank balance. There are times and places when it is better to have $100,000 than it was to have $200,000 at another time and place. And there have been other occasions when it was better to have a cargo of potatoes or a supply of axes and glass beads than either sum. The emphasis in the investment problem is usually placed on the proper selection of securities. I suggest that the emphasis would be better placed on how the investor intends to spend his income. The initial mistakes are made in this latter department. The wrong securities are chosen largely as a result of this initial philosophic error. The peculiar investment plan of my horse-betting gentleman lacked nobility, but it did have the virtue of being modest and hence workable, just so long as the investor would abide by his promises to himself. Consider the case of a family which has, besides a modest earned income, $100,000 to invest. Just now it seems that they ought to be able to glean from this an average yield of something better than $3,000 a year, with reasonable safety. No, I don't quite know what reasonable safety means, but all we investment men use the expression. Suppose the family invests the money at this rate. Their chief problem now, I suggest, is not so much to watch their investments as to watch themselves. So long as they can attune their material needs and their social dignity to that income, they can retain that reasonable safety. But perhaps the time comes when the family feels they can no longer hold their heads up on the block unless little Paula goes to a fashionable finishing school. For that it will be necessary to jack up their income yield to $5,500. Perhaps the family's feeling about Paula's education is unreal and unreasonable, but this is a problem more for discussion with their minister or a psychologist than with an investment broker. Their investment man, however, can arrange the larger yield in a jiffy if the family asks for it. Let us suppose he arranges it. He simply sells out the conservative bonds and substitutes riskier securities. Little Paula goes off to the school with a cute wardrobe, and it is to be hoped that while there she gets jammed full of fascinating social graces. She may come to need them in all earnest, because by the time she is graduated, her marriage portion may indeed consist exclusively of social graces. Chapter 9. Reform, Some Yeas and Nays. The preceding chapter has no doubt suggested that the greatest of investment mistakes is in trying for too high a return with its attendant tragic risk. Not many will deny that. But that is only the half of it, or perhaps only the quarter of it. Our subject does not seem to admit any 100% truths. There is a reverse side to this picture, which reflects a condition that has been particularly in evidence these last 5 years. This is a tendency on the part of men in a fiduciary capacity, including trustees, executors, and lawyers, to play so safe with a client's funds that they just don't perform any useful service at all. They take the family's $100,000 and invest it at a yield that is closer to 0% than has ever been seen before. They tell the inquiring family to run along and play, if it can find some inexpensive game. They apparently feel that they have earned their fees by putting the money in a safe place and by refraining from stealing any of it. An intense and needed reform wave has swept Wall Street in recent years, and the tendency just mentioned may be cited as one of its lesser and less fortunate results. The advisor who gets next to nothing in yield for his client isn't doing much for the client. He is simply avoiding responsibility for himself. He claims that he must duck responsibility, that he doesn't get paid much for being right, and that if he should be wrong these days, he might easily lose his reputation. He says that he might possibly even be called for by some large, taciturn men wearing blue suits with brass buttons. I believe he exaggerates, but he has got a point there. Was it stolen, or did you lose it? This book has thus far skirted 2 juicy topics, Wall Street crookedness and the many steps that have been lately taken to regulate it. This should work no hardship on the inquiring student, because there are reams of printed material on these subjects. This book has chiefly tried to paint a picture of thousands of erring humans of varying degrees of goodwill, solemnly engaged in the business of predicting the unpredictable. It has been further suggested that, to this effort, most of them bring a certain cockeyed sincerity. The picture in the popular mind has always been more sinister. The public feels that Wall Streeters are not dunces at all, that they are crooks and scoundrels, and very clever ones at that they sell for millions what they know is worthless, in short, that they are villains, not children. Everyone interested helps to perpetuate this picture. The outsider believes it readily enough, else how did those stuck-up Wall Streeters get so rich? The burnt customer certainly prefers to believe that he has been robbed rather than that he has been a fool on the advice of fools. Even Wall Street men themselves tend to encourage the idea. They are ever ready to confide to you what they know of the inside dishonesty of someone else. Faced with the huge losses investors have suffered, their egos subconsciously suggest to them that it is better to be regarded as a Machiavelli than as one who has spent his adult life engaged in mumbo-jumbo. The crookedness of Wall Street is, in my opinion, an overrated phenomenon. The hearts of Wall Street men are not more or less black than the hearts of the men in the sausage cover game. There is probably the same percentage of malpractice, but the Wall Street depredations are more spectacular. They involve vastly greater sums of money, and they make more interesting reading. Best of all, they suggest to the public an excuse for the public's own folly. The indignation school of writers never tires of pointing out the millions that are stolen in the street. But while the millions are being stolen, the billions are being lost. Nothing crooked, just bad luck and bad brains met together in an effort to do something that couldn't be done in the first place. There are, of course, plenty of ways of stealing money in Wall Street. They range from the stealing of $12.50, an eighth on 100 shares of stock, to $1 million, 4 points on the underwriting of $25 million worth of bonds that never should have been underwritten. There are infinite variations on these themes, and as the techniques and circumstances grow more complex, the rights and wrongs of the question become harder to establish. For example, let us try to consider a few of the moral and legal problems of the specialist on the floor of an exchange. The Board of Governors, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and others have been considering them for years now. However, there are some ethical complexities here that would baffle an investigating committee headed by Socrates and St. Thomas Aquinas. the involvements concern what a specialist must and must not do, and when he must and must not do it. The specialist, as you know, is the man who keeps the book in a stock. On the left-hand page of his book, he enters the buy orders that are placed with him, and on the right-hand page, the sell orders. Whenever the orders of a buyer and a seller come together, he executes the transaction and collects a commission for doing it. This part of his duties is quite all right, and perhaps a machine could be invented to do the same thing. But the specialist also steps in sometimes and buys or sells for his own account, risking his own money. Everyone agrees that he has to do this when it is necessary. If he didn't, many of the executions would be shocking. They would be sometimes points away from the last sale. Thus the effort has been to formulate fair rules which would show when his action was necessary and when it was larcenous. The result has been a discouraging welter of legislation, hard to understand and harder to apply. Many specialists feel that what the verbiage actually boils down to is this: the specialist is expected to use his own orders to help maintain an orderly market. But, while performing this public benefaction, he is told, in effect, to be mighty careful that he doesn't make much money for himself. There will be no objection if he loses much money for himself. I have before me an extreme sample of a specialist's problems. It is a sober account of a dramatic occurrence, much more dramatic than the usual dilemmas of a specialist, of October 19, 1937. The opening of the exchange on that day was one of those terrible things which, because of careful regulation, we are not supposed to have anymore. At the opening bell, prices were slaughtered and all sorts of incredible things happened, but one of the price transactions seems to have been executed by the specialist in Nash Kelvinator stock. He bid $5 a share, though on the previous day the stock had sold at an average of 11. He bought 8,300 shares at the opening transaction at $5 and did not re-offer any stock in the market for 23 minutes, although in part of that time the market had rallied strongly. He probably made his first sales around 8, and the next day the stock was back where it had been the previous day, at 11. For these interesting activities, the Board of Governors of the New York Stock Exchange suspended him for 3 months. This gives rise, in order, to the following 4 thoughts. 1. My goodness, such goings-on, turn the rascal out. 2. So they suspended him for 90 days, did they? That seems to have been a Daniel come to judgment. A man who has made $30,000 or more, most of it in 23 minutes, would naturally like to take the wife and kiddies somewhere for 3 months, rest up and spend some of it. 3. But just what did they punish him for? For only bidding $5? Things looked frightful at 10 o'clock that morning. Would the Board of Governors have bid $6? Would they even have bid $4? Would the SEC have bid $3? Would you, dear listener, even have bid $1? You only had a very short time to make up your mind, and incidentally, did you happen to have $8,300 in October 1937? Or perhaps the emphasis in the accusation was placed upon the fact that he failed to re-offer the stock for 23 minutes in a rising market. This may be a sounder accusation, although 23 minutes hardly seems an excessively long time to hold on to a purchase. This writer is unable to arrive at any real sensible judgment on this point. The only standard of criticism we seem to have is that he made too much money for so short a time. We may conclude loosely that the punishment fitted the crime. 4. If at any time during the next fateful 23 minutes the market had broken further and Nash Kelvinator stock had sold down to $2 a share, would anyone have thought of punishing him for losing $30,000? Horizons and limits of regulation. All reform, as Lincoln Steffers has brilliantly demonstrated, is in at least some respect disappointing. I recall a needed bit of effective moral uplift that the stock exchange authorities themselves successfully enacted before the SEC was established. They put an end, once and for all, to the ancient envelope racket. This was a system of unofficial rebates or of small-time bribery, whichever way you cared to regard it. Certain employees have in their jurisdiction the handing out of commission business to other brokers. They are supposed to decide these allotments on the basis of efficient service. Some of them, from time immemorial, had decided on the basis of the envelope, which was a plain envelope with cash in it. These envelopes were more or less surreptitiously handed out to them each week by the firms that got the business. The stock exchange decided to remove this mote from its own eye, and proceeded to do so with complete effectiveness. The reform was in every way a necessary one, but even at that it was still possible for an intimate spectator to observe some social consequences which could be regretted. It was a bad year, and most of the employees in question were getting meager salaries outside of this petty larceny. The envelopes contained cash, and the clerks who received them could, if they were so minded, use the cash to get the children's teeth fixed. But with envelopes taboo, entertainment took their place. At that period, the only way to entertain an order clerk was to take him on a tour of the West Forties, which kept both entertainer and entertainee up all night. Indeed, no entertainment was considered to have tapped the fullest of bonhomie until one or the other of the celebrants had lapsed into delicious unconsciousness in the ultimate taxicab. The money that was not received for the kitty's teeth eventually had to be expended anyway to lash down Papa's kidneys to keep them from floating away. The purposes of the SEC are much broader and more important than such small matters as that. Although the official dedication is stated differently, the Commission was called into being by an angry populace. This populace was extremely sore, and it wanted something to be done to prevent so many of our citizens from losing so much of their money in Wall Street. There have always been other agencies more or less fitfully trying to prevent our citizens from losing their money in other fields, such as the racetrack, the crap table, gold bricks, real estate, and their own unsuccessful commercial ventures. It is all part of a human, decent impulse which is pretty hopeless. It is an effort to put a little truth into the falsest text in the language. God tempereth the wind to the shorn lamb. He doesn't, you know. Look about you. I do not believe that the majority of Wall Streeters, if they actually were presented with the chance, would wish to see a return of the good old bad old days. This majority, which have consciences, just like you have, believe it or not, are screaming like souls in purgatory. But I think what they are screaming about is the way the details of reform work out, rather than the initial principle. It is a long, involved subject. I am only making an effort here by touching on a few of many matters to point up some of the discrepancies between what is hopefully planned, and perhaps occasionally insincerely planned, and what happens. It is hard to get a proper critique of the SEC. My view, for instance, must be somewhat biased because I have been, and still am, connected with Wall Street. But the view of someone from the Corn Belt is not going to be very useful either. I have at times fancied that I detected in the SEC a spirit of gleeful vengeance, which should not be the attitude of a regulatory body. A police force is supposed to keep a city orderly. Destroying the city is not among its duties. It has been a long time now since I have observed an honest broker stealing his customary eighth, or a banker his customary million. This is the result of splendid work, and it is high time the country had an authorized body capable of accomplishing such work. But I find myself wishing that the Commission would perform its functions with a little less zip and hurrah. Could they not model their procedure and publicity a little closer to that of the Department of Weights and Measures, and a little less to that of the G-men looking for a public enemy? Perhaps the most important work of the Commission has been the minute scrutiny of new issues. Nothing could be fairer than this needed reform, and it has been carried out to the letter. Wall Streeters felt that such scrutiny would make underwriting too difficult, but the Commission felt that the public deserved to know every last detail of a new bond or stock issue. The Commission has had its way for some years now. What has happened? Well, nothing very much. In 1936-37, there was a boom on. The carefully scrutinized new issues went like hotcakes, and Wall Street's fears proved ungrounded. Then came the recession, and down went everything, just as in the old unregenerate days. After that bull market ended, some of the scrutinized new issues set modest records for the amount of money an investor could lose within a few weeks after subscribing to the issue. In this connection, there is a minor point of some interest. In the days before the SEC, the description of a new issue commonly consisted of a couple of pages, containing an inadequate balance sheet, a skimpy indication of recent earnings, and perhaps a little pep talk. This leaflet didn't begin to contain the things that an investor should know, but it did have one tremendous advantage: an investor could be persuaded to read it. Nowadays, a properly registered prospectus contains everything. It is as long as this book, and duller. Just looking at it causes the intellect to shrink up into a ball of protest. I imagine the same number of people have read one of those things through as have read and finished Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen. The Securities and Exchange Commission has long bent its efforts toward the maintenance of an orderly market. This is praiseworthy, but they haven't achieved much in that direction. Only the dull markets have been orderly. I imagine that the Maritime Commission would like to maintain an orderly ocean. But when the heavens split and the lightnings crack, one commission is about as effective as the other so far as maintaining orderliness is concerned. The SEC has not been loath to join the popular hue and cry against the friendless short seller. From this, we have a right to deduce that they not only want an orderly market, but a market which shall forever gently rise. Of course, that conception is just plain silly, like Voltaire's suggestion that a community ought to be able to support itself by everybody taking in everybody else's washing. I have no doubt at all that the commissioners understand what makes sense and what doesn't, at least as well as I do. But the majority of the public does not, and the Commission represents the public, from whom, in the last analysis, it receives its mandate. My suspicion is that the commissioners sometimes strive to please their public with regulations that they can't have much faith in themselves. It is humanly asking too much of them to say to the public, "Now just stop fretting yourselves about some of these things you don't quite understand." Indeed, one of the chief points on the agenda of the SEC has been to work toward the ideal of a completely informed investing public. This effort is in every way laudable, and progress, though necessarily slow, should be assured. However, just as a fanciful exercise in paradox, let us consider what would happen if on some miraculous dawn the entire investing public woke up to find itself completely informed. That would certainly be the end of an orderly market, for a panic, either bull or bear, would ensue. Everybody would know whether to buy or sell, and whichever it was, everybody would be trying to do the same thing at once, and there would be no one to complete the other side of the trade. Orderly markets, like horse races, exist on differences of opinion. Wall Street needed the SEC just as baseball after 1919 needed Commissioner Landis. But people who are interested in baseball are more realistic than people interested in Wall Street. The fans did not expect that Judge Landis would do more for the game than keep it reasonably honest. They did not expect him to improve the quality of the fielding and hitting. Nevertheless, a considerable part of the public seems to be expecting that the SEC will make speculation and investment safer. These hopeful individuals are reminiscent of the benevolent soul who said at the beginning of the poker game, "Now, boys, if we all play carefully, we can all win a little." In conclusions, the customary construction of a didactic book is for the author first to explain, as realistically as he can, the circumstances and problems of his subject. Then, at the end, there is a section, something like the answers in an algebra book, entitled A Constructive Program, or Whither. The interested reader can scarcely wait to get to this section, which will settle once and for all what the administration should do next, or what is the good life. The notion, a debatable one, is that the man who knows the problems necessarily knows the answers. This book has not been successful if it has not suggested some big-league problems such as, 1. Should our financial machinery be scrapped? 2. Should it be further tinkered with, and if so, how much further? 3. Is capitalism doomed? 4. What active stock selling under $5 looks hot just now for a quick turn to pay for the Buick the wife just bought? There isn't an assistant instructor in economics in any faculty who can't answer these and similar questions rapidly and categorically, and if that is not enough, there are a million laymen eager to do so. So, I don't feel that my vote is much needed. For the record, and if anyone cares, I will state that I have a sneaking fondness for that wretched old hag, the capitalistic system, after watching the performance of her temperamental younger rivals. I believe we had better preserve our financial machinery, even with much of the nonsense still adhering to it. The way we have been brought up, we all have a fondness for articles which can only be made in plants costing millions of dollars. Few of these articles can be produced by a fellow and his uncle working behind the garage. The only successful method so far devised for getting millions out of the public for enterprises both good and bad is some system similar to the devious mechanisms of Wall Street. Money has occasionally been raised from the public by smacking the citizens with the broadside of a saber, but the results of this were always less than satisfactory. On problem number 2, I do not choose to commit myself with any lucidity, but I am willing to submit an idea to the Securities and Exchange Commission that perhaps they have thought of themselves. They are in the position of a doctor who has only one patient, with no prospect of ever getting another. It would be a tactical error to kill this patient, even though a commendable scientific zeal prompts the doctor to try out his whole shelf of pharmacopoeia on him. After all, there is no real danger in this case of the patient ever becoming completely cured. The answer to problem number 4 is being withheld for our special 5-star flash. Merely clip and fill out the coupon, enclose $2, and the name of this stock will be sent to you in a plain envelope. In conclusion, I must remind you that I work in Wall Street and assure you that my organization is of course quite different from anything I have described here. Perhaps what you are looking for is a long-range, comprehensive investment program, conservative yet liberal, which will protect you from the effects of inflation and also deflation, and which will allow you to sleep nights. In this case, just stop in at my office and let us recommend a program. I will see to it personally that your inquiries are referred to the head of our crystal-gazing department. This has been an Audible Incorporated production of Where Are the Customers' Yachts? Or A Good Hard Look at Wall Street. Written by Fred Schwed, Jr. Narrated by Mark Mosley. Producer Mike Charzik. Copyright 1940, 1955, 1995, 2006 by Fred Schwed. Production copyright 2012 by Audible Incorporated.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.